Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal and policy frameworks that shape the global order. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the president and founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am delighted to be joined by my good friend, Axel Addy. Axel, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure to be working with PILPG, and it's quite exciting to know that you have a podcast. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, Axel, I was inspired by your Trade for Peace podcast that you had me on a couple of years, and I thought, that's a great idea. I've got to get a podcast. Well, today's episode continues our exploration of paradigm shifts in the international system. We will examine how emerging economic, technological, and geopolitical transformations are reshaping development, trade, governance, and peace building. Let me spend a few moments talking to our audience about Axel's bio, just so you all have a sense of where he's been and where he's headed. Now, Axel previously served as Liberia's Minister of Commerce and Industry and as the chief negotiator of Liberia's historic accession to the World Trade Organization, one of the fastest WTO accessions for a least developed country in the organization's history. Now, during his tenure, he also led efforts to empower small and medium-sized enterprises and promote inclusive economic growth in Liberia. Over the years, he has emerged as an important global voice on the relationship between trade, peace, and development. This has included supporting the development of the WTO Trade for Peace program, which works to assist fragile and conflict-affected states seeking integration into the multilateral trading system. Today, he serves as the host of the WTO's first podcast, Trade for Peace, and advises governments, investors, and multilateral institutions through his work as the founder and the CEO of EcoCap Investment Group. Axel, it's a great pleasure having us with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Axel, let me start with the first question of your origin story. You've had an amazing career in trade, development, having a ministerial position in Liberia. What inspired you down this path? Was this a childhood dream, or did something happen in undergrad or early in your career? How did you end up where you are today, so engaged on these trade and peace and development issues?
Well, actually, I came to this work through experience, not through an intellectual interest in trade theory. When I was appointed Minister of Commerce and Industry, Liberia was in a critical moment of post-conflict reconstruction. The country had gone through about 14 years of conflict before I joined government. And I worked on sort of rebuilding the economic institutions that have been destroyed during the conflict. What I did not anticipate was that we'll be able to face a second shock after going through this protracted conflict, which came during the Ebola epidemic. And so in 2014, the Ebola epidemic hit Liberia in the West Africa region. I watched our GDP collapse from close to 9% in 2013 to less than 1% in 2014, and then eventually zero in 2015. I saw that in dollar terms that we lost over $200 million in GDP. The fiscal deficit hit 8.5% of GDP, and we got to see our foreign contractors leave. Our investment dried up, major infrastructure projects were stalled. And in a country that was still somewhat fragile, where the legitimacy of the state was tied to its stability to deliver economic improvement, this was not just an economic crisis, it had become a governance and a stability crisis. So with that experience, and what that experience actually taught me was that the connection between economic governance and peace in most concrete possible terms. It meant that when markets stop functioning, when businesses that employ people close, when the state fiscal capacity contracts and it cannot deliver services, the population calculus about whether stability is worth protecting changes. And so Ebola was sort of my first true lesson in terms of the tie-in between economic stability and peace. When people real needs are at risk, then they they look at survival, the need to survive kicks in. And I saw this shift happening in real time during the crisis. So my role at the time was really managing trade, ensuring that critical commodities were coming in the country at a time when shipping restrictions had been applied for vessels coming into Liberia, at a time when some of the critical commodities needed to support the emergency response would kick in. And during that period, it inspired me to really commit to using trade for development. It inspired me to see what we could do when all the support, external support goes away. What can a country do to really reactivate the economy, to really drive activities, particularly around the smaller businesses, the SMEs? And that drove my conviction about MSME inclusion. Those were the businesses that were completely destroyed during the crisis. Market traders, small retailers, transport operators, food processors, they had no reserves, no access to credit, no public procurement opportunities. And so we're then able to sit down and say, look, okay, the economy has been disrupted. Um, at the macro level, the big investors are not here, but our daily survival depended on those small transactions at the micro level, SMEs. And so we're able to then say, okay, what, given our limitations, what tools could we put in place to help reactivate small businesses? And so we're able to push through what we call the Small Business Empowerment Law. We made an attempt to use public procurement uh, to get small businesses going, to reactivate small business participation in the economy so that money begin to flow within the economy and drive greater inclusion so that the citizens feel like they are part of the recovery. And we're able to achieve that. And with the first year of the implementation, we saw over $80 million in contracts from the government going to small businesses. And so, while my journey started actually not focusing on trade, I think being appointed minister and then having to go through this crisis, and also while negotiating WTO accessions, uh, inspired me to want to make that a lifetime commitment to helping developing countries to use trade for development and sustainable peace.
Well, Axel, it's clear that the Ebola crisis and then subsequently the COVID crisis had a dramatic impact on your career trajectory and how you were making a difference with Liberia and other developing countries. Some would say we're now facing another crisis. We call it sort of a paradigm shift, a profound transformation of global and economic political order. And you and I were talking before we hit the record button about, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets crushed, meaning some of the smaller economies. Uh, would you agree with the statement that we are experiencing a paradigm shift? Or this is just another zig and a zag in the global order, and we'll have to adjust and accommodate it, but things will settle back to normal? Or is this something new? And if so, what are we looking at as a new paradigm?
No, I do agree, actually. I do believe the evidence is quite clear that this is not a normal cycle of geopolitical adjustment. We are watching the dissolution of sort of the post Cold War consensus that economic interdependence would produce political convergence, that multilateral institutions would progressively expand their reach and that the interests of major powers will be channeled through a rules-based system rather than raw competition. But there are three features that defines this shift, I believe. First, we see geopolitics has entered economics. For 3 decades, trade policy was treated as a technical discipline. Supply chains were built on efficiency logic. This is all over. I think major economies have recalibrated or continue to recalibrate trade policy toward security and strategic objectives, with national supply chain security and technology competition now driving decisions that were previously governed by efficiency logic, right? Where we can get the best price with the highest production efficiency, that's where we'll go. That is now shifting around national security interests. And so the practical consequence we're seeing is that trade relationships for smaller economies that depended on those relationships with large economies is beginning to change. It's less governed by the multilateral trading system and rules that would help smaller countries negotiate. Second, there's now a complete fragmentation in global governance. We see at the multilateral level, we see that even climate negotiations that produce agreements are not adequately funded. We see that debt relief negotiations are proceeding bilaterally with major creditors operating outside of coordinated frameworks. And so the institutions built in the mid 20th century are struggling to absorb 21st century challenges. Third is the one I find most consequential for the communities I work with, the shift in who bears the cost. Fragile states, small economies, the world's poorest population really did not cause the disruption, but often they're absorbing a disproportionate share of its costs through commodity price volatility. You know, I was in Liberia a couple of weeks ago. People are paying almost $6 a gallon for fuel. That has a real impact in an environment where most businesses operate at a micro level, at the SME level. And so there's huge implications for people's livelihood. It's about the impact on people's livelihoods. We see development assistance transition towards investment and growth partnership models. And we see fiscal management challenge during the adjustment period falls hardest on governments that have not yet built the domestic revenue base to replace the external financing. So this is something that is happening across many developing countries, across many fragile economies, whom oftentimes really do not have the capacity. The revenue authority is still collecting taxes to, if not through royalties, to trade commerce, and that is shrinking because of a global crisis. So they will have to think outside of the box. In the same way, international rules-based system now are forced to think outside of the box in terms of what does multilateralism look like, for the current reality. I would add a fourth feature that I do think that really does not get enough attention, and that is the erosion of the fiscal space in developing countries at exactly the moment when they need it most. Aid is declining. We see debt servicing is consuming larger shares of government budgets. And so commodity revenues are volatile. And in this environment, we're also seeing a rush for critical minerals and climate asset concessions that is extracting value from some of the world's most fragile economies while leaving almost nothing behind. I believe this fiscal squeeze, the extraction dynamics, are, in my view, the defining vulnerability of the current period for the countries that I work with.
So Axel, let's pick up on that a, a little bit. The change in the global order, the competition for rare earths and critical minerals and the extractive nature of the process. is impacting vulnerable and fragile states, and particularly in Africa. How do you see this playing out in the next 2, 5, 10 years? How worried should we be, and what can we do about it?
Well, for developing countries that really do not have a capacity to negotiate at an equitable level, I think they will have to work more within the frameworks of the African Union for African countries, within the African Union and regional bodies, to really begin to develop innovative approaches to tackling some of these challenges. I think the supply chain fragmentation has caused uh, more countries to organize regionally. So Asian countries, Europe, and the Americas will consolidate. I think, and that will leave the African producers vulnerable at the periphery. But I do believe South-South trade, this is also going to push more South-South trade, which was at 38% across developing countries, is now increasing with the AFCFTA implementation. Today, it's at 57%. And I think you're going to see more and more of that happening. I believe that with more investment, you're going to see that increase even further. And I think more and more countries are going to push for value addition uh, and working within the region to again industrialize at the regional level to meet their needs as the world consolidate across regions. I think also one has to focus, and I talk a little bit about this in my trading piece log, on looking at domestic revenue in areas of opportunities. And I think areas such as, digital trade provides an opportunity for developing countries to generate taxable revenue. I think there needs to be a framework put in place. I think rules for digital trade, cross-border data flows, e-commerce taxation, and the treatment of digital platforms operating in developing countries um, provide a new opportunity for fragile economies. And so I think things like the moratorium e-commerce in the WTO puts a strain on a lot of developing countries who are dealing with fiscal constraints and are looking for new opportunities to mobilize resources domestically. That is an area I believe that would help in terms of giving the right assistance. I also believe how a lot of these countries will negotiate critical mineral concessions or climate related investment is important. And is important not only for the countries, but also the investors, countries coming in, negotiating these massive concessions. In order to really protect their investment, they have to ensure that responsible, inclusive governance with strong institutions that are transparent are in the countries where they do business, because that's the only way to secure their investment. Otherwise, it leads to potential conflict because you will see more and more people feeling excluded out of these massive investment. We see that in Liberia, where that's a massive gold investment concession that is common talk that, they exported over close to $1 billion in gold out of Liberia. But the area of their concession is surrounded by poverty. And people are beginning to speak about it, that if you're going to have such an investment, it's in the investor interest to ensure that whatever benefit the government is getting is also beginning to trickle down to those who should be benefiting from such investments.
Speaking of agency, the agency, the people of Liberia. Let's talk a little bit about the agency of Liberia. And as we mentioned in the introduction, Liberia's accession to the WTO was one of, if not the fastest for a less developed state. What lessons did you, and you orchestrated that, what lessons did you learn that are applicable to other small states in Africa as they try to retain their agency, some control over their future destiny with this shifting global order. Are there other things you learned during that experience that you're building upon or that are transferable at the moment?
Well, I mean, I often speak to a lot of acceding governments or recently acceded governments. And the most common question I often get, especially when I'm visiting capitals, is what does this mean for us? How does this translate into benefiting us? Um, the accession process, I often say, is not for the WTO's benefit. It's a reform blueprint for the country's benefit. And in order for it to work, one, you have to build trust domestically across stakeholders. This is something we're able to establish at the onset, building trust across key political actors, key stakeholders domestically help with the interagency coordination that was needed to sort of move the process forward. We also saw that process as a rebranding process. Remember, we're going through this process during the Ebola crisis where we lost a lot of investors due to the crisis. And when we wanted to showcase that Liberia was willing to constrain itself through commitments to international rules and standards, uh, to pretty much say Liberia is open for business. And so it was a rebranding exercise. We also use that to look home through the economy and see, look, where are the constraints? What are the challenges? And through that process, we're able to identify key areas and begin to work towards modernizing a lot of our legislation that were outdated, uh, creating new institutions. I was just in Liberia not too long ago, and I was invited to the National Standards Authority, which was a law we drafted a long time ago during the W2 accession process and had been going through several iterations. But the authority, the act had not been passed. So it was good to see that the act has passed and now it's an institution that is going to help, especially when it comes to SPS standards, to help support exports. I also visited, with the Liberia Tourism Authority, which is a law that was created again during that accession process to again drive what can we do domestically to create employment and drive inclusion. Tourism seems is like a sector that could drive youth employment and and create new opportunities for domestic investors and create jobs. And so that was an act that was drafted. It was passed just recently, not too long ago, and now you have an authority. So the reform process is for the country to look to send a signal to investors. One, the country is committed to transparency, is committed to good governance, is committed to the rules-based international trading or multilateral trading system, but it is also committed to helping investors invest in the country. Now, has it been perfect? Absolutely not. Uh, the commitments are quite cumbersome, especially when you're in a resource constrained environment. The obligations are tasking to governments that really oftentimes do not have the resource to fund some of those commitments. And so it comes with a set of challenges. But I would say you still have a blueprint of what is needed to improve the economy, what is needed to move the country forward, what is needed to modernize the economy and drive inclusion, which is critical when you're trying to sustain and protect the fragile peace you have in the country.
So using that trade and the infrastructure around trade and
Right.
development to secure, to build a durable peace. I want to
Yes.
pick up on something you'd said in the answer to the previous question, where you talked about fragmentation and regionalization with this shifting of the global order. There's both fragmentation among the different blocks and regions around the globe. There's also a lot of commentary about maybe the future is going to be regional focused. And I'm curious for your thoughts on the global south, the BRICS, Africa, West Africa. And so help us think through Is there going to be regionalization? And if so, how should we more precisely think about the region or the regions of Africa and what role they might be playing in the paradigm shift?
Well, I like to think of it as having simultaneous patterns of trade uh, for convenience. So uh, you can have trade with Africa happening at the multilateral level for convenience for certain things. Most of it now is around critical minerals, and those negotiations are happening. Uh, then you have some regionalization taking place for convenience. Some of it is security, some of it is convenience trading partners that have a history of trading. But I think, given the vulnerability and sort of the volatility of the global economy, countries are looking across the border to see, okay, how can I improve trade with my neighbor? What do they need that I have that I can supply, and what I need they can supply. So you're going to have that taking place. Now, the architecture around governance, as you see within the AFCFTA and the RECs, the sort of the regional economic communities, whether it's ECOWAS or EAC, there's some work with EAC with Somalia that is trying to integrate. Um, it's forcing country to, one, align their laws and modernize their laws and protocols and regulations so that the flow of trade becomes easier and easier within the region. So instead of looking to China for some commodities, you look within the region to see what is the productive capacity within the region to meet some of those market demands. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. I think at the AU level and the AFCFTA level, there are still some challenges in terms of meeting the commitment. A lot of it has to do with resource limitations. But I think the pressure has intensified given what's happening outside of the continent. And so I think more and more countries are looking at how do we strengthen um, the regional arrangements to help facilitate trade and the movement of our people across the regions.
Well, Axel, I want to now take this conversation globally and in particular trade for peace, given your expertise in all the number of podcasts you've done and the papers and the advising work you've done on trade for peace, and ask a little bit whether there's still hope for trade for peace and how you see this evolving. At the moment, everyone's thinking China, Taiwan. Couldn't they just become trading buddies and skip over this whole 2027 potential conflict, military conflict, or embargo, or however one wants to predict the future? We also see what's happening in the Gulf and how the mutually beneficial trade didn't really stop the United States from doing what it did, or from Iran from blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Um, is there still hope? Do you still have hope in trade for peace? And if so, what's it going to look like in the coming years?
First of all, I think we can say that trade is still happening. No matter the circumstances or the challenges, trade is going to happen. The cost of trade, for some, there are going to be winners and losers, as always. So the cost of trade for fragile economies has skyrocketed, especially when you so import dependent. Um, but trade is going to happen. It is happening. Is it going to impact stability around the world? I think in some economies, the more and more the cost of living increases, the higher the probability of potential security challenges, especially in fragile settings. Oftentimes citizens would then begin to look at the legitimacy of the government in its ability to provide the services that is needed for its citizens. We hear, Cuba doesn't have fuel. And that's a big challenge, right? Citizens are not able to conduct business. So there's a huge disruption there. Now, whether that disruption translate into some sort of security challenge, it depends on the culture. It's very hard to predict in a country that has been stable had experienced peace for decades, will weather the storm over time and will give the government, I believe, the grace to look for ways to resolve those challenges. In conflict, in countries that are, you know, in and out of conflict over a decade or two, um, then you're going to have challenges from different forces to challenge the legitimacy of governments. And it's not only in fragile economies. You see in the UK today, the current government ability to tackle some of the challenges the UK, they're facing issues of, say, how many newly elected heads of institutions or government you're gonna have within that decade. I think that today I heard in the news they've now passed Italy. So there's this changing of leadership that you will see more and more of if what is happening on the global side it happens. I mean, it prolongs, go on for a prolonged period of time, and you know, countries like Liberia, we've been through we went through conflict, then we had Ebola, then we had COVID. This tiny country, I've experienced a lot. What I can say, I think that culture of violence that came with the conflict um, is no more because I see even in political disputes, people now are running to the courts for resolution instead of running to the bushes. And so I think Liberians have, with all the challenges, I've gotten accustomed to the peace dividend over close to going on 2 decades. And so there are no key players that are going to be advocating for changing governments per se. I can say the same for some other areas. You're going to see more and more if things continue the way they are and prices continue to, countries begin to see double-digit inflation, then of course you're going to see, especially if there are opportunities for new actors that are politically strong, going to challenge current regimes that control power. So, in a nutshell, I think trade will continue. I think trade will continue to, be a vehicle as a source of potential conflict or as a source of sustainable peace. What we can say is, in spite of the security issues and the challenges collectively across the globe, I think there's a certain level of multilateral cooperation that is taking place, and that's my hope that there's still a series of multilateral frameworks and cooperation that is taking place within the WTO, within the OECD, within ASEAN, within the African Union, that is taking place that is still driven by consensus, and so I believe that will weather the storm of these disruptions.
Axel, let's talk a little bit about that multilateral consensus. And I'm curious for your views on the future of multilateralism. Oftentimes, folks will talk now about minilateralism, basically a takeoff of regionalism.
Mhm.
But what are the World Trade Organization, to a degree, has been highly effective. There's some criticism. More recently, the United Nations gets criticized from both sides. And then the funding is slowly being turned off by the United States and by some others. Is there still a bright future for multilateralism, or what are your thoughts on what the future holds for some of these multilateral institutions that you know so well and have worked closely with over the decades?
I think for institutions like the WTO, I think decision makers and stakeholders will have to be creative uh, given the circumstances. Um, the appellate body, for example, has been effectively paralyzed. What is the alternative? Reforming the WTO 2.0. What does it mean? You know, there are new areas that requires rules, but rules in the interest of whom? The larger economies or the smaller economies. Things like e-commerce, for example. Um, that's requiring new work for the institution. Areas in terms of critical minerals. That's new work for the WTO. I think those are equally important. issues of climate. I mean, a lot of developing countries don't even have the capacity to talk about carbon trading and what does that mean. Liberia has one of the largest remaining forests, which is a carbon sink for Europe and northern countries. What does it mean to have good governance and government to protect that forest? From the logging concessions who are ready to cut it down. So I believe the challenges presents new opportunities for institutions like the WTO to begin to think outside of the box in terms of what does multilateralism mean to the majority of the global population, not to the EU or to China or the US, but to the bottom billion that operate, that actually live in these critical resource rich territory. The Congo and some of these places have huge minerals needed for the new shift to AI and all new innovations that are taking place across developed economies. What is it? What is the WTO role in building the capacity of the DRC to negotiate terms that are mutually beneficial to the country, to be held account, the government to be held accountable to its citizens, that they benefit from the dividends that come out of those investments, so that investors are protected, because investors are investing billions into the country to get those resources out. But an unstable Congo or an unstable Liberia has implications for investors. Does the WTO have a role to play in that debate, in that discussion? So things like the e-commerce moratorium is something that needs to be looked at. But just digital trade, in essence, what's happening, when countries hear about, oh, a mobile money system earn 300-400 million dollars in remittance going to my country, and the government has no line in its revenue collection framework to tax and generate some revenue from that transaction. It means more work needs to be done through the multilateral trading system, the World Customs Authority, or the Customs Organization, the WTO. These institutions have to be able to support these new innovations. What does AI mean? And data protection, what does it mean for countries that are on the bottom end of that equation? What can be used? What benefits lies for developing countries? Is the WTO relevant for what developing countries are dealing with in today's reality? So I think it is very, very important that giving the sort of this regional approach to dealing with these global challenges, that the WTO also begin to look at new innovations to respond to some of these rules that are being created through regional organizations.
Picking up on regionalism, let's go back to some of your earlier comments and let's unpack a little bit more the future of Africa in this emerging global order. As you mentioned a number of times, rare earths and critical minerals play an important role in the future economic development of Africa. The potential for economic growth is astounding given the other natural resources and the human capital in Africa. Do you see Africa beginning to play more of a role in the architecture of this new global order, or not yet? And if so, why not?
It's difficult because oftentimes Africa is the center of the conversation that will define the next 50 years. But the problem is that most of those conversations are happening about Africa rather than with Africa. And Nowhere is that more consequential than in the governance of critical mineral and climate resources. The DRC alone, for example, roughly holds about 70% of the world's cobalt, critical to battery supply chains that power electric vehicles and AI data centers. Zimbabwe, for example, has significant lithium. Zambia and the DRC holds enormous copper resources. Africa holds an estimated 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves that the AI and clean energy transition depends on. But that conversation is happening outside of Africa, about Africa, rather than with Africa. Even the conversation that appear to be with Africa come with very limited support for the institutions that should be part of that new architecture to govern the resources so that there's mutual benefits. I think significant investment in African minerals uh, is needed. I know the U.S. Mineral Security Partnership. There are 6 U.S. bilateral critical minerals agreement that I was signed in 2025. But that investment should not only be extraction, it should also be around the soft infrastructure, building the governance and the transparency around the critical mineral governance to the benefit of those who live within the investment resource area. DRC copper and cobalt operations are the institutions that have legal oversight over the management of those resources, capacitated in a way that they're able to monitor those resources and acquire the benefits that is needed to build the country. The more you secure the stability of the DRC by empowering its citizens, by tackling poverty challenges, and each citizen can see the benefit of those investments, the more secure the investment. But you have a big rush across the continent to sign these massive deals. And oftentimes, the institutions on the other side of the table uh, do not have the resources to truly come to the table to negotiate in an equitable way. So I think within the African Union, the presidents are working towards how best to look at this at a critical level. But political will for me translate into the resources made available to the institutions that govern critical minerals. So Africa is the center of global attention because of the wealth of its natural resources, but it also would need the technical support to ensure the governance of those resources are mutually beneficial for all parties.
Axel, you've touched on artificial intelligence from a number of different perspectives. I want to ask the question of literally about the elephant in the room. With the rapid development of artificial intelligence and the utilization of artificial intelligence, how is that going to impact or even reshape the labor markets in Africa, uh, reshape industries, international cooperation and competition? It seems every morning we wake up and read that our friends in Silicon Valley have released yet a new um, suite of functionalities, a new stack of functionality that AI uh, can do. Good, bad, indifferent, empowering, destabilizing for small states and African states.
Well, I'm a big fan of AI because I think it provides a unique opportunity to leapfrog into today's reality in many countries, many poor countries across the continent. Um, they need to build the capacity of teachers to deliver the skills needed. I think you can cut that by many years using AI. So much so that you can build tools and software that would teach even at the village level. So I think, you know, improving outcomes um, is something that you can embrace and with the right partnership and the right support and leapfrog Africa, a lot of African countries in critical sectors forward by using AI. Now, AI works best in a more industrialized environment. That is not the case in most countries across Africa. Most countries across Africa, societies are mostly agrarian society. But AI intelligence in terms of crop rotation, weather patterns, irrigation innovations can improve production, and help enhance food security. So that's in agriculture. I think something that should be embraced. Um, are there risks in terms of jobs? Well, I'm not sure. You have, maybe in the larger, more developed African economies, you might say some of the services sector may face threat with AI. Graphic designers, for example. Now I don't need to hire a graphic designer. I just need to know how to instruct an AI to do what I needed to do. Um, but for me, if you have one area you could use AI innovations is working with revenue authority to sort of map out revenue collection opportunities and see how you can generate revenue in a more efficient manner. Like I said, as we said earlier, a lot of these countries are facing resource constraint. And so new innovations that help to improve domestic resource mobilization are going to impact their ability to find new space for revenue collection. I always gave the example at the Ministry of Trade. When I was appointed, my team and I, we noticed that out of the revenue lines in the revenue code that the Ministry of Commerce should be generating revenue on, reporting on, only business registration was being reported on as a source of revenue contribution and revenue collection from the ministry per the mandate. But we saw that there are so many other opportunities for revenue collection. But in order to do that, you needed to have the resources in your budget to do that. So things like industrial compliance, GMP standard enforcement, import and export testing and qualification and quality analysis. All of these things presented opportunities for the government to generate revenue, uh, but they were not being exploited. And so revenue reporting, you saw from the Ministry of Commerce, said business registration, and that was it. So I believe with new technology, new innovation, I think, especially for countries facing huge revenue constraints, you can begin to improve revenue collection. I also think, with the push because of the global challenges, this push towards more regional cooperation, especially in the area of trade, I think you're going to see more knowledge sharing and exchanges across the region. So how Botswana manages its diamond resources with De Beers could be a model for Liberia to manage its gold resources with concessions that are exporting gold out of the country and looking at ways to do value addition domestically. So I think you're going to see more and more of that.
Yeah, the AI will help understand and unpack some of these conundrums or untie some of these Gordian knots that limit revenue or limit fair and equitable trade
Absolutely.
relationships. You have
Absolutely.
access to expertise at your fingertips, just asking your GPT. Let's,
Yeah.
Axel, you've been very generous with your time. I just have a couple of more questions. I want to ask a question that frequently comes up in the commentary on this great power competition uh, between the United States and China, a little bit with Russia here and there. In the old days, one could have strategic non-alignment, but at least at the moment, both the Americans and to a degree the Chinese are requiring states to pick sides. It's us or them. Are you seeing that? And I know Liberia has a long and deep relationship with the United States, but are you seeing this in Liberia, other small countries, other African countries, or countries that you work with around the globe that they can no longer navigate great power competition through strategic non-alignment, or yeah, they can still do that as long as they are below the radar a little bit.
I think most countries, you know, are trading with both partners where the interests, uh, strategic interests are aligned. I think, countries came for US Africa Summit and are looking for ways to work uh, in partnership with the US government. You have China FOCAC that happens every couple of years. There again, I think most African governments do not see their role as having to take side in a fight that has nothing to do with them. It has to do with moving their economies forward. They have more critical uh, issues in terms of how do we create a fiscal space that is able to deliver on our national development priorities? And whomever is willing to support us, we should be working with those partners. So, you know, it's normal to see Chinese investments, building roads and infrastructure, US investment in technology and innovations happening simultaneously in a lot of countries. Um, and I think countries that have been able to navigate very skillfully without having to take sides, because the most fragile economies have more pressing priorities and are looking for support wherever they can get it. I do think, though, AGOA going away is going to, I'm hoping that it is extended and reactivated and funded because, you look at the investment going uh, into Africa, the trade reached about over $300 billion in 2025 from China. Uh, U.S. trade, you know, it's nowhere near that. And I think AGOA providing an opportunity uh, to increase stronger and build stronger U.S. partnerships. But I do believe it needs to be changed somewhat, restructured, so that it is beyond, oil exports, but more larger investments into infrastructure, into critical mineral management, into systems, into IP, for example, which is much, much needed.
Well, Axel, I have just two more questions for you. The penultimate question is, given your leadership experiences over the last couple of decades, what lessons would you share with mid-career professionals who are entering into these leadership positions, or young professionals who aspire to be future leaders? What mindset did you adopt that contributed to your success as a dynamic young leader?
I think I'll give you the operational answer rather than the inspirational one, because I know the audience works in the field and generic leadership advice is not really useful. So I would say first, quality is political sequencing over technical knowledge. So leaders navigating transition and managing multiple reform agendas simultaneously against resistance from actors who benefit from the status quo. So political sequencing is very important. Building consensus across key political actors. We wanted to pass, for example, the SBA law. The law says government is going to make procurement commitments for SMEs because we wanted to bring SMEs into the formal economy. Okay. In order for that law to be structured the way it is, to create that architecture for bringing in SMEs, I needed to be able to work with the Minister of Finance, my counterpart. I needed to be able to work with the Revenue Authority. I needed to be able to work with the public procurement concessions. I needed to get the political buy-in uh, to ensure that not only when the law was passed, it was actually implemented. So we worked very closely in sequencing the drafting, the passage, and the implementation of the law. So as soon as the law was passed, the public procurement institution set up a special program to train SMEs to almost like the SBA here to build the capacity of SMEs to complete the application and register for public procurement opportunities. The Minister of Finance created a special window to execute payments to SMEs in a shorter turnaround time than it would take for normal procurement transactions. Um, and then we had to get the buy-in of the cabinet to ensure that the SBO procurement submissions were on time and were also promoted to the business community. So you have to get the political buy-in over the technical knowledge. You got to understand the political dynamics across stakeholders in order to move the agenda forward. Oftentimes, you will get resistance, but if you're able to align the political actors around the idea, you can have an impact. The second, I would say, quality is honest communication about cost. Uh, uh, we saw that the transitions with the WTO accessions came with cost implications. The country could not afford some of the commitment, and so we knew we needed to have some quick wins. And so we invested in some low-hanging fruits. What are some things we could do? For example, all the different fees that were attached to business registration, we eliminated a lot of those fees and had a standard fee for doing business registration. We saw an increase in compliance. More and more businesses were willing to register because now was not a cumbersome process. The process had been automated, and a lot of those different fees that they run from agencies to pay now had gone away. You had one central fee. So we communicated this to stakeholder, got their buy-in, and so it was very clear. It was published, and we have more compliance with that. So it is very important to communicate the cost. We said the W2 accession comes with wins and losers. Um, some sectors have been targeted for liberalization. The good thing with Liberia, a lot of the sectors are somewhat already liberalized, so that helped a bit. Other sector, we needed to work with those stakeholders to look at the costs and communicate the costs to those stakeholders. Like the Bar Association have a lot of restrictions about practicing law as a foreign trained lawyer in Liberia. And so we had to work with the association to look at the implications and to look at what their cost calculation would be in terms of liberalization and what layers they have put in place to accommodate participation of foreign trained lawyers. The third is quality is institutional patience. Patience, when working in public institutions, is sort of the foundation for moving any policy forward. You're working across stakeholder with competing political interests, with varying levels of technical capacity and understanding. And so the ability to oversee a reform process requires serious patience. I remember we worked, for example, with our committee on commerce and industry and the committee on foreign relations on the WTO accession because there are a lot of protocols to be ratified and a lot of laws to be passed. Well, midway through that process, there was a round of election that happened, and a lot of members of our committee, you know, left, lost their seats. So imagine now having to go to the new committee members and say, we're working on this WTO accession and say, what exactly is the WTO? We have to start that process all over. So I would say the third quality is patience, being able to work with interministerial committees, being able to build consensus around the policy reform, being able to identify the key political actors that are able to move things forward. Um, is a key ingredient to success. And I think this is what led to our success on the accession process and even passing the different laws that was needed to push through the reforms.
Axel, those are great words of wisdom, and I do appreciate you avoiding the Harvard Business Review. Be enthusiastic, or whatever the little thing that you put on with the picture on the wall with the little inspirational
Yeah.
quote. Those real concrete suggestions about quality, patience, perseverance, which lead to successful leadership. Axel, we've covered so many topics over the course of this hour. Are you leaving this conversation optimistic and hopeful about the future? Hopefully you are. But if not, and if you're a little pessimistic and a little bit cautious, share with us how you're feeling. This is the touchy-feely part. I'm Californian, so this is the
Yeah.
touchy-feely part of the podcast. How are you feeling about the future and why?
Well, you know, also went to school in California, so
I
I
remember that. I
understand.
remember that, Axel.
Yes, yes. I'm optimistic, actually. When I see the pace of innovations that are happening around AI, for example, whether it's healthcare, education, um, I'm optimistic that a lot of this now will cut the transition of a lot of poor countries. It will cut the timeline in terms of the ability to leapfrog into 21st century in terms of systems. I'm also optimistic about the AFCFTA. I think, given the global challenges, it makes even a greater case for strengthening the full implementation of the AFCFTA. I know there are a couple of operational systems that are being put in place. You have the Pan African Payment and Settlement System, which is supposed to reduce the cost of transaction by 27% now across 48 countries with tariff offers submitted. I believe the AFCFTA, if ever there was an opportunity to consolidate faster, I think, given what's happening around the world, I think this makes an even stronger case for the AFCFTA. I also believe that you will see more consolidation across the continent in terms of having one voice around critical mineral, climate, and technology deals. I think countries talking more across borders are looking for ways to see how best they're able to support each other as you look at, okay, given the resource constraint, revenue authorities have to be more creative and they're going to be looking at how they expand revenue collection around these critical resources. My second source of optimism is in the generation that is entering African institutions and businesses. I think when you travel all across Africa, you see young people that are using all sorts of technology innovations, whether it's agriculture, health, or education, um, that is creating new opportunities for their peers across the continent. I remember a young man who was my intern over a decade plus ago. Um, you know, went to school at Dartmouth, moved back to Liberia, started what was supposed to be, I think, a buying company for palm kernels to ship abroad for biofuel. Um, that has transformed into now a lotion and soap company that he's beginning to export. But every time I visit Liberia, I see he's grown bigger and bigger, and I see the number of young people he has employed. And it leaves me very optimistic. I last year I held a golf tournament to support a golf sort of fundraising event to support a young man who had raised money to build the Liberia Learning Center. And we're able to, for example, raise money to pay for library cards for about 300 young people. And they organized for me to meet with these young people and just touring the facility and seeing the work they were doing there, helping young people with their lessons, helping young people apply for opportunities to study abroad. That leaves me optimistic. Third, I believe, is leverage. At a critical time, I believe countries that are endowed with critical mineral deposits have leverage to negotiate better deals that will equally transform their economies in the interest of their population. And I believe the AU Green Mineral Strategy in the 2025 Congo Basin Assessment are early signs of a more coordinated approach in terms of how countries can structure investment partnerships that would be mutually beneficial, not only for the investors, but for the country. I know this because Liberia is a victim of seeing investors transform a whole region, and then war happens, and then everything is destroyed. And those areas had some of the best schools, best facilities. They are now ghost towns, you know. So I know the impact of having quality investor that is, I would often say quality trade as I see it benefits all parties. Not only the investor coming in, but it also creates new opportunities for the domestic private sector. That is, it was to build wealth across the population. The concerns that keep me up at night is the pace gap. The pace of disruption from climate change to AI to the mineral concession rush, that pace is faster than the pace of institutional reforms. The institutions are not moving fast enough in the reform to play catch up. Climate change is not waiting for new frameworks. AI governance frameworks are being set up, but it's moving at a much slower pace. People are building things and doing medical diagnostic, and doing all sorts of innovations. And countries are not setting up the institutions of the framework to provide the governance needed. So the pace at which things are moving are too slow. For example, mineral concessions. The mineral deals done in Liberia 16 years ago or 20 years ago, and how they were structured has to be different from the mineral deals done today because the priorities are different. The government is much more constrained in a very volatile global environment. And so governments have to be very careful how they structure new concessions, impact critical resources that once taken, you can easily replenish. Because the pressures from external pressures to internal pressures are going to undermine the legitimacy of a lot of governments if they don't pay close attention to these challenges. I remember I was in South Sudan and there was a massive flooding in one part of the country, that wiped out livestock and people, devastated this one part of the country. So climate change is happening. The institutions and the framework for rapid response are moving at a much slower pace. So I think improving the pace of the institutions will require some investment on the part of development partners that are working with those governments. And I guess then they have to be more creative in terms of how do you tie in your resources, your resource endowment to helping with the investment to bring some of these institutions uh, to the level of capacity to be able to support the development of the country. We passed about 20 some more laws during the WTO accession. We were able to use public procurement to help SMEs. And out of that experience, we saw a lot of innovations. But for me, the most powerful aspect of it is the protection of the fragile peace in countries like Liberia, where countries have gone over a decade of peace. We're seeing now more respect for the rule of law and people going to court instead of forming warring factions. So that leaves me hopeful for the future.
No, I think this, again, you and I both having experience living and studying in California, this pace of innovation is something you and I are comfortable with, but it is outstripping institutional reform, you know, rules-based developments, rules-based regulation. Now, the good news is for my students at American University, it's a jobs program for lawyers. You're going to need even more
Yes, it
lawyers
is.
to,
That's
to
true.
develop these new institutions, the reform, the regulation of all of this innovation and transformation. Well, Axel, thank you for taking the time over this last hour on this podcast, and thank you for all of the amazing work that you do as a senior peace fellow with PILPG and the work that you do every day, both for Liberia and for other conflict affected and small states throughout Africa and the globe. So thank you, Axel. It's been a real pleasure.
And it's been a pleasure too, Paul. Thank you and congratulations for the podcast. I look forward to hearing more of it. Thank you.